His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello, and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. You ever go back to your old school, not just your high school, but your elementary school? Everything feels oddly small and shrunken, and the hallways are too narrow, the desks are tiny, and you look around and the things on the wall are strange yet oddly familiar, and you might have flashbacks to tests and assignments and grand friendships and alliances and competitions, probably some stress and trauma mixed in there too. What do you think the building retains of all that life that happens within it? Do you think the walls soak it up? Do you think the history remains after all the kids are gone? We're going to test that theory. Today we're going to rewind back further than the memory of any of you listening right now. Stay tuned till the end for some audio footnotes. But other than that, there is no homework. All you have to do is take your seats and give your full attention to today's very special guest.
My name is Zach Studenroth. I guess technically I'm an architectural historian. Worked many years here on Long Island in preservation work, architectural and historic preservation. So that's my field.
Great. And Zach, thanks for joining us tonight. And we are here to talk about, I don't know if you would consider it maybe one of the unsung forms of architecture or building on the island, but your recently published Images of America book, Historic Schoolhouses of Long Island. What would you say? I mean, we'll get into a lot of things, but is the schoolhouse in architectural circles looked at as sort of a stepping stone to something else, or what do architects think of designing schoolhouses in your experience?
So that's a very interesting question because they're typically, the ones we're talking about here in the book are the early ones, from the 1700s up into the mid to late 1800s. And these are the little guys. These are the small buildings. So they're not, architecturally, they're very rarely all that imposing. I guess they from our investigation and in any event, from our perspective, they gain disproportionately in significance with regard to how old they grow. So in other words, to find one of these little guys dating from the 18th century is a major event. And these tend to be the smallest of the bunch. So, so in terms of architecture per se, they're not, they're really more historically important, I'd say. I had to get into the discovering what the derivation of the form is, or what the origins of the actual form of the building were. That was important. And then, of course, that changes and evolves in the 19th century. But no, it's really more, I think we're really more in an area of social history as opposed to architectural history, because these little buildings represent, a key component in a community. And oftentimes the very construction of a schoolhouse is significant of community.
Well, just to get to that point, the social history and people familiar with this series, it's a lot of great images, and you pack a lot of information into the captions. So you go through that history. So what if we start early days, like what the earliest examples you found, what did you learn about the role of the schoolhouse in different parts of Long Island? Was it one of the first structures built? Did it come later after other things, or?
Well, so it's quite interesting because the whole notion of, public education doesn't become codified or in any way regularized until after the Revolutionary War. And this becomes an indication of a kind of a larger and unified image or notion of what settlement is, and that we need to educate, our citizens, et cetera, et cetera. That becomes on a state level, really, that becomes codified. So, and that's not until the early 1800s, really. So earlier on, each community is really responsible for, presumably individuals, within the communities, were responsible for deciding that educating the youth was something was a priority of some sort. So the allocation of funding to construct the building, to hire the teacher, to entice a teacher to come to the community, these are all handled in very different ways. So, we do have instances of this in the 17th century. So, as you know, our earliest settlements are dating 1640 and on. So we have a long history in the 1600s as well. And by the 1680s and 90s, you have individual examples, in Huntington and other communities of hiring school teachers and actually constructing little schoolhouses. But that was one community at a time. So the whole business of establishing schoolhouses in communities only becomes uniform after the state passes laws and regulations for establishing that. And that's in the 18 teens. And that's where we see a kind of a standardization of the actual form of the schoolhouse.
And it is basically, and you can correct me on any architectural terms, but these early stages, it's basically just a big room, right? A single structure, big rectangle.
Yes. And it wasn't as if the state was determining that, but rather individual communities were copying those of others. And it becomes a kind of a standardized architectural form that serves the purpose. That isn't to say we also simultaneously had a tradition of constructing academies. Clinton Academy is a very well-known one out in East Hampton. And that's, again, post-revolutionary from the 1790s. And these are catering to people who can still afford to send their children. Typically, they would be sent to a community where they would board with a local family. There would be a tuition paid. And that was for older students. The little one-room schoolhouses were primarily geared toward teaching, elementary school, we would think it in these days. Whereas the academies would take the education to older children and broaden the curriculum. So you would have exposure to, let's say, learn Latin or some of the sciences, things of that nature. Primarily sons, but not universally. Clinton Academy actually had female as well as male students. But the male students were being prepped for going off to college, oftentimes Yale or one of the nearby colleges of the period.
And was there a pattern in terms of when schools were added to, across the island, Nassau and Suffolk, which you concentrated on? Is it the places you would expect, the Southold and Southampton, like the major centers got them first and they took longer to maybe build later in other places?
Well, turns out that when the state entered the picture, this is in the 18 teens, with the intention of subsidizing and promoting and ultimately mandating the construction of schoolhouses in and for communities, is placed on funding under what nowadays the expression would be underserved communities. Now, what that meant at the time, upstate Western tier communities in which people were widely scattered and there wasn't a sufficient concentration of wealth or community to result in a natural process of construction schoolhouses. So the state stepped in to subsidize that effort. And as it turns out, at that time, Suffolk County was considered, somewhat remote, not Huntington or Southold or Sag Harbor or East Hampton, but rather you might say the inner inland of town of Brookhaven, for example. So Middle Island gets 2 schoolhouses. Now, it was tough because the idea is to position these schoolhouses such that a student can walk to school. Well, that oftentimes predicts where these schoolhouses get located because they had to be accessible. But in the more remote communities, like the ones constructed in Middle Island, they had to strike a balance, and these were sometimes quite a distance from the actual population. And I should just comment that in starting out on the research of these schoolhouses, we and it still retained the title of them being Long Island schoolhouses. The reason that Nassau County is not as well represented as Suffolk, for one thing, it's geographically, it's considerably smaller, but because it's much more populated, many of these schoolhouses that once existed have disappeared. And although we could draw on historical photographs as well, we found it easier and we found much more material to work with from Suffolk than Nassau. But we endeavored to include as many Nassau examples as we could find.
What's interesting to me is, or one of the things that's interesting is the preservation of these structures and how they get repurposed in terms of as communities progressed and the old schoolhouse was outgrown quickly. What were some of the interesting reuses you found for some of these buildings as they survived?
Well, you're so right to point that out. That was pretty much one of the more exciting aspects of the project. We actually came to this because my partner in this to begin with, Kurt Kahofer, who was himself a retired school teacher, elementary school teacher, owned and lived in the Fender's Schoolhouse, which had been out of business as a school in, I believe, the 1950s. Years go by, it eventually was purchased and converted for use as a little chapel. We found a photograph of a little cross up on the peak of the roof. And then later on, it was converted into an actual little house, which is condition that he bought it in. So the point of these buildings is their simplicity is very conducive, to a number of uses. And it was really thinking about that and thinking back over the years, the ones that we've seen that have been repurposed. The one out in Southold Village, which is now on the grounds of the Historical Society right downtown. When I first visited it back in the 70s, it had been converted for use as a machine shop. It was on its original site. Eventually, it was gifted to the Historical Society and moved and restored back to its original condition. But in many instances, actually, the reason that these little buildings survived as well as they have is that they found adaptive uses which kept them, viable. The one in Amagansett, for example, which has since been moved to the grounds of the main school, which is right on Main Drag as you drive up through the village of Amagansett. But it was moved there, having been moved off its original site and repurposed for storage. I think this fellow was I don't want to say he was in the whaling business, but he was something nautical. He kept all his gear in this little building. So, it just basically became a little storage shed for him. So, these little buildings go through a lot sometimes in their journeys.
And just to get to the picture sources, one of the things that stuck out to me looking at the range of great pictures you found was the work of George Bradford Brainerd, who happened, or you tell me, was it happenstance that he happened to take pictures of schools? But explain who he was and some of his pictures.
Well, he's a personal hero of mine. This man, he was an amateur photographer, Brooklyn native, and evidently what he would do, this was a pastime, was to load up his photographic equipment and board the train and come out onto Long Island. He did this over a period of, this would be from the middle of the 1870s up to the early 1880s. And he just walked around and he took pictures primarily of buildings. So he was interested in recording, or he found them picturesque, what have you. And so this is George Bradford Brainerd. His original photographs are glass plate photos at Brooklyn Historical. And altogether, I think it was I found 16 or 17 of his photographs of schoolhouses across Long Island. And so I believe I was able to incorporate all of them because they're very high resolution, beautiful quality, and quite evocative. The one of the Sagaponic School, which there is today a Sagaponic schoolhouse, which I guess dates from maybe the late 1800s, 1880s, 90s or so. It's a wonderful little, still a small schoolhouse, but it was built on the site of the original schoolhouse, and it's Brainerd's photograph of that schoolhouse, which is so evocative. You see not only the school, but you can sense that you're near the ocean. There's something very flat and very desolate about the whole setting. It's quite a beautiful photograph. And there were several of his pictures, which the one in Centerport is unique. It's right on the little harbor that comes in there. The Brainerd photographs are really remarkable. And anyone doing research on Long Island in general should know that this fellow is out there taking pictures in the 1870s, and many of them are uploaded and are searchable, the images, online on Brooklyn Historical's website.
Yeah, I'm flipping through as we're talking, and he really does capture these vistas. It looks like a totally foreign country.
Yes, yes. The other one purpose we wanted the book to serve, and therefore we dedicated a whole chapter, the last one, to the schoolhouses that people can visit today. These are ones that, for the most part, not always, but many of them have been moved to museum settings. This is true in Cutchogue, Old Bethpage Village, out in Oyster Ponds Historical. They actually have two of them. East Hampton Historical has two that have been moved to their site, and it happens to be next door to the Clinton Academy, which East Hampton Historical also owns and manages. So they've got three buildings there. And museums at Stony Brook, as I still refer to it, I guess they've updated their name. And then there are a handful that have been moved onto the grounds of contemporary school properties, with the intention of somehow incorporating them into the curriculum to sort of give the students of a certain grade level, a flavor of what teaching and learning was all about 150 years ago.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I mean, again, you do a great job detailing the social movements and developments and the buildings. What did you glean about the way the children might have felt about school or acted in school?
Well, you know how students can students still grumble about their experiences. One of the reasons that we were first introduced to and then decided to develop into a full chapter dealing with Walt Whitman was that Whitman, of course, is known to us as, America's poet and all of that. But since he started his career as a school teacher, he developed very strong feelings about the deficiencies of teaching in the period. This would be, he starts teaching in the late 1830s, just for a few years. Then, of course, by the 1840s, he's a newspaperman. He goes on to become a poet, etc. But in his writings are very strong opinions about how the teaching profession was failing students, and that it was very punitive and based upon sort of rote memorization. And his theory was essentially the opposite, sort of the Socratic method of soliciting students' opinions and thoughts on subjects and interacting in conversation and that sort of thing. And he was adamantly opposed to corporal punishment, which was simply the way a lot of the teaching was handled. And you should realize that there was no standard for teaching teachers. Typically, and Whitman would have been an example of this. His father was a farmer, was also a house builder, not entirely successful. They moved to Brooklyn, and then they moved back to the South Huntington area. Whitman did not want to become a farmer. He didn't feel that that was the right career choice for him. And so what does a young man do in that period if they're not expecting to inherit land and some prospects for support? For some young men who were, and this is almost universally a male profession in the early 1800s, so teaching becomes a way of avoiding a less pleasant way of supporting yourself or making a living. So the requirements on the teacher were simply that they had some ability to read and write that they could impart to their students. So there were a lot of, we did quotations of people reflecting back to their days as students, and not fondly. I mean, the universal opinion was that they were freezing cold in the winter, boiling hot in the summer, and that the older children terrorized the younger ones. And so you wonder how anything much was accomplished. But through it all, most of the students survived the experience.
Yep, as do most of us, I guess.
Yeah.
Wait, anything else you want to get across about the research or the sources? We mentioned Brainerd, but it looks like you made good use of a lot of historical societies. But
Yes.
Any other points you want to get across about the book?
Well, this had been a fascination of mine prior to this project was octagonal buildings. And I was really pleased to see, and they've restored it in Brentwood. It's now on the grounds of the high school property there. Of course, Brentwood having originated as a utopian community back in the 1850s, named Modern Times. And what was considered quite modern in the 1850s was the notion of building structures in the octagonal form. This was considered to be quite novel, striking. And so folks in Modern Times decided, when they were granted their own school district, which first had to happen, that they would construct themselves a schoolhouse in that mode. So that one still survives, now restored. The other one was up in Yaphank. And the reason for that was that there was a local fellow, Weeks, wealthy, educated, curious, got involved in all sorts of projects. And so he brought the concept of constructing a new schoolhouse. He was also the school commissioner in the octagon mode. What is just amazing about that one, again, one of these survival stories, is that later on, after it was no longer used as a school, the community converted it into a firehouse and constructed an addition off the front so that their fire engines could poke into this thing. And so we have a photograph of it when it was a firehouse, which is really kind of an extraordinary picture. But that goes to show you the lengths, communities would go. Rather than discard this little building, they found another use for it. But we were helped by so many, there's a network there. So we have so many wonderful historical societies, of course, across virtually every little community seems to have one. Also have librarians, either archivists or the heads of special or historic collections in many of our libraries, and they have collections. And then, of course, there's a whole network of municipally appointed historians that may be village, town, of course, county, and they have collections. And so, with all of those sources, we had begun the project, but COVID sort of shut everything down, and then it went on a back burner and we had to revive it. So it took more years than we had anticipated. But even with that, understood just the number of collections that we had to search was hundreds, and everyone was so obliging, very grateful for that experience.
No, that's great. And you both did a great job. It's a great, I just, as an aside, I did one of these volumes myself with a colleague on Oakdale. So I know,
you did?
I know the struggle to get the captions and the photos.
All right. So, yes.
So yeah, actually, I'll ask you that as a fellow author of these. What was the biggest struggle in terms of completing the picture? Like for us, it was finding the right cover.
Well, it's always about getting the pictures. I think they set a minimum because it's a very standard format. This, to be honest, the challenge here for us for this particular book, I had done one for the Cutchogue, New Suffolk area as a community a number of years ago. And the challenge there was to find enough photographs to illustrate these two, farming communities where I wasn't sure we would get enough visual information, but eventually we were able to do that. In this case, with the schoolhouses, it was finding images that were kind of compelling, that weren't just a standard little schoolhouse. And then, of course, Arcadia, as a professional publishing house, they have very high standards in terms of the quality of the images. So at times we would see a photograph, but it wasn't of a high enough quality reproduction. Or we'd get a great picture and we couldn't find the story for it. So those are the biggest challenges.
Well, I don't want to keep you much longer. Anything you want to tell us about where you're promoting this or projects you're working on? We'll help you plug anything you want.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I'm encouraging primarily, the historical societies or communities that are represented in the book are, of course, the ones, that would be most interested. I've spoken at Bridgehampton. I'm going to be going to Bellport, about 3 or 4 others at Shelter Island. So really, just about all the communities are represented here, close to, if not their very own schoolhouse. So I enjoy talking about it, as you can see. And so anybody who wants to contact me, they certainly can. I guess through you have my contact information.
Sure. And again, good luck with talking about it and getting out there and sharing, again, what is a very
good,
striking book. I commend you both for it. And thank you for talking with us tonight.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Zach Studenroth. His new book, written with Kurt Kahofer, is Historic Schoolhouses of Long Island, out now from Arcadia Press. We will link to related resources in our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And we have one audio footnote for you today. It is from episode 89, when we talked with Cynthia Shore of the Walt Whitman birthplace.
And he returned to Long Island to be a school teacher. There was an ad, and he answered the ad, and he came back to be a school teacher, and he would live in the different families on Long Island. And we have a boarder's receipt to show that he lived in one of the homes here on Long Island.
That's it for today's episode. As always, thank you for listening.